So we have some interesting news when it comes to potential spoilers for Impact Wrestling Sacrifice and Impact Rebellion in April, considering the Impact World Championship and the TNA World Heavyweight Championship and the status of AEW World Champion Kenny Omega in Impact Wrestling. Now, of course, Impact Wrestling Sacrifice is scheduled to take place on Saturday, March 13, exclusively on Impact Plus. We will be doing a watch-along for the event, so be sure to subscribe, bottom right-hand corner. You won't miss a single thing when it comes to Impact Wrestling over the course of the next few months. There's certainly going to be a lot going on when it comes to Impact soon. So, according to the latest Wrestling Observer newsletter, the main event for Impact Sacrifice is going to be Impact World Champion Rich Swann versus TNA World Heavyweight Champion Moose in a title versus title match. Now, the match already took place during the early February tapings. Now, they have said who won the match, so I'm not going to say that here. I'm not going to spoil it. We don't do major spoilers. We don't say things like that ahead of time. Obviously, the information is out there, so if you want to go and search it, that's up to you if you're going to spoil it. But for people that still want to go into the event with a little bit of surprise and try and enjoy the show, I'm not going to say what the actual result is, but as I mentioned, it has already taken place in the early February TV tapings, and a winner has been crowned and a double champion has been crowned. Now, Dave Meltzer speculated this story is setting up the winner of the match versus AEW World Champion Kenny Omega at Impact Rebellion on April 24. Now, of course, back in December, when Kenny Omega made his debut for Impact Wrestling, he referred to himself as, quote, a belt collector in his first Impact Wrestling promo. Now, this could also play into the story. In addition to that, as we mentioned here on the channel, also, the Rebellion poster does have the Greek letter for Omega in the middle of it as a hint to Kenny Omega wrestling at the pay-per-view. Again, we've covered this on the channel, so be sure to check that out. We go into a very big deep dive on that. Now, of course, at January's Hard to Kill pay-per-view, Kenny Omega and the Impact World Tag Team Champions, the Good Brothers, defeated Rich Swann, Moose, and Chris Sabin. Omega pinned Swann after hitting him with the One-Winged Angel. Omega hasn't appeared for Impact since that pay-per-view, which isn't necessarily true. He did actually appear on the post-Hard to Kill episode of Impact Wrestling. That was in a pre-tape segment. Since then, Don Callis and Kenny Omega announced that they were going on hiatus to focus on AEW. Of course, Kenny Omega is going to be facing off against Jon Moxley at Revolution in an explosive barbed wire death match, whatever they're calling it. So it's certainly interesting when we move back to Rich Swann and Moose that this is what we're getting. And again, I don't want to be one of those people who's like, I told you so, I told you this is what they were doing, I told you so, but we've been saying this. If you're a regular viewer of our Impact Wrestling videos we do here on the channel, you would have seen that I said I thought this was the direction that they were going in. Ever since Kenny Omega referenced that he was a belt collector in that first promo that he did for Impact Wrestling way back when in December, everyone knew that eventually we were going to get title versus title, or we were going to get Kenny Omega at the very least challenging for the Impact World Championship, and that's what we're going to get. It was just a case of who is the champion that Kenny Omega is going to be facing. This is another thing that I've mentioned time and time again here for the Impact World Championship and the TNA World Heavyweight Championship, is that we've been teased this Rich Swann versus Moose storyline and this Rich Swann versus Moose match for a really long time now. Ever since Bound for Glory, we as fans have been conditioned and told by Impact Wrestling management and storylines that you're going to get Rich Swann versus Moose at some point. It's happening because, of course, Rich Swann wins the Impact World Championship at Bound for Glory, defeats Eric Young in the main event. But on that very same pay-per-view, of course, Moose, the TNA World Heavyweight Champion, defeated EC3 in that weird cinematic, I guess you could call it a match, I guess you could call it a victory. The purpose was to elevate Moose and take him to the next level and make him feel like he's a credible World Championship potentially champion and also a World Championship challenger. And they absolutely achieved that as well. Coming out of Bound for Glory, what was the first thing that Moose did? He confronts Rich Swann backstage when he's celebrating with the Rascals, basically indicating, keep an eye on Rich Swann and Moose because they're going to have a match at some point down the line. Now, I think it took a little bit longer to get to this match than originally intended because of this AEW Impact Wrestling relationship, which wasn't on the cards back in October. That really exploded in December. I think originally we were probably going to get Rich Swann versus Moose at Hard to Kill. I think that was always going to be the original plan. considering that the next pay-per-view after Bound for Glory was Hard to Kill in January. But, of course, the AEW relationship happens. AEW President Tony Khan and Impact Wrestling executives Don Callis, Scott D'Amore, and Ed Nordholm, they managed to set that all up. And then AEW becomes a factor, so the Rich Swann versus Moose storyline actually gets quite extended whilst inserting Kenny Omega into the middle of it. So, as I mentioned, Rich Swann wins the world title at Bound for Glory. He then moves on, actually has a match against Chris Bay at Final Resolution. But Moose, in the interim, feuds with Rich Swann's best friend, Willie Mack. Why did he do that? Once again, because I think the original plan was to have Rich Swann versus Moose at Hard to Kill. They needed to give Rich Swann and Moose a reason to come together. That was Willie Mack. Moose wanted to send a message by attacking and destroying Rich Swann's best friend. They achieved that. That led, of course, to the I Quit match in January at Genesis, which actually Moose lost. But what happened by Moose losing, it was actually Moose just destroying Willie Mack to the point that Rich Swann, Willie Mack's best friend, had to come out to the ring and say, look, just stop it. If you stop it and you quit right now, I'll give you a World Championship opportunity. And that's all Moose wanted. So he said, I quit, and it sets up this future showdown between Rich Swann and Moose. In addition to that, also, I mentioned it was Genesis in January, but I actually touched on Final Resolution there with Rich Swann and Chris Bay, where Rich Swann defeated Chris Bay for the Impact World Championship to retain it. What happened after that? After that match, Moose comes out and hands the World Championship to Rich Swann. So they've been teasing this in November, December, January at Hard to Kill, of course, because after Moose had defeated Willie Mack and he got that future World Championship opportunity, of course, they teamed up at Hard to Kill with Moose replacing Alex Shelley. And, you know, credit to him, it was an absolutely sensational performance by Moose. Arguably, well, not even arguably, probably his best performance inside of an Impact Wrestling ring. So since October, November, December, January, we're now in February and we're going to get the match in March. They've teased this match for 5 months. So we were always going to get to this point, and as I mentioned before, it was going to heavily tie into the eventual Kenny Omega match. Now, there was a couple of different scenarios that I spoke about before that I thought could happen when it comes to the Impact World Championship, the TNA World Heavyweight Championship, and the AEW World Championship. I thought that possibly at Rebellion we could see Rich Swann versus Moose versus Kenny Omega, Impact World Championship, TNA World Heavyweight Championship, and the AEW World Championship on the line. Now, that's not going to happen. We know it's going to be a singles match. Again, I'm not going to say what the singles match is going to be, but I always felt that it would either be Rich Swann or Moose to face Kenny Omega, because one of those people would be the Impact World Champion, and that's what we're getting at this point. That's the scenario that we're in right now. And when it comes to the TNA World Heavyweight Championship, for me, that was always going to be the outcome, was that it was eventually going to lead to a title versus title match, because you have to think about it. What is when they introduce storylines like this, you have to think, okay, where is the end goal here? Where is the end game? What is going to be the conclusion of this storyline? And by bringing back a former world championship and treating it not like a legitimate actual championship, more like a $1 million championship, it's more ceremonial than anything. What's the end game with that? Because you can't carry it around forever. I mean, there is only one true world champion. Eventually, the storyline has to be championship versus championship, unify both titles and put them together. That always has to be the end goal there, doesn't it? So that was always going to be the end game ever since Moose brought it back in April at Rebellion last year. But Rebellion wasn't a pay-per-view, it was actually a TV event. So for me, ever since Moose brought that title back, it was eventually going to be a champion versus champion match, unification match. It was just going to be a case of who would be the Impact World Champion that Moose would face. We now know that it'll be that it is Rich Swann. It's certainly interesting as well, and again, I don't want to get into the result of the match, so I've got to tread lightly on this one, but you have to recall that Moose's contract is expiring in April. Now, we'll do a video later on as we get closer to the date, because between now and then anything can happen, but there's been quite a few stories, hasn't there, about Moose and his contract situation with Impact Wrestling recently. As far as we're aware, he hasn't signed a new deal, and I know you've heard this story over and over and over again when it comes to talent with Impact Wrestling over the course of the last 6 or 9 months, whether it's Taya Valkyrie, Ethan Page, Sami Callihan, etc. The list goes on, and eventually it's 50-50, isn't it? They're going to stay or they're not going to stay. But Moose, when it comes to Moose, we know that his contract is expiring around April time, which ironically is around the time of Impact Rebellion. He hasn't signed a new deal. I know Don Callis referenced at Hard to Kill that he had signed a new 3-year deal or 2-year deal. He was actually referencing Moose's past deal. He still hasn't signed a new contract. Doesn't mean he won't stick around, because we've seen the likes of Sami Callihan and other names Sometimes they can work without a contract, or a lot of these times in pro wrestling, because they're an independent contractor, it's a constant back and forth negotiation until they get right up to the last minute, and then it's a case of they're staying or they're not staying. And some case people leave and then they come back. Trey Miguel, another great example of someone that's went away, looked like they were going to go to WWE or AEW, and they're back working for Impact Wrestling right now. So that's a possibility as well. Does that factor into what is going to happen at Sacrifice? Again, I'm not going to touch on that because again, I think it gives too much away. But credit to Impact Wrestling. I think they took their time. They took their time with this. Again, in my opinion, and I don't know this to be the case, but in my opinion, this was probably the scheduled main event for Hard to Kill, I think. But because of the AEW relationship, because of what happened with AEW becoming a factor with Impact Wrestling, because of Kenny Omega's jump to Impact Wrestling and appearing on Impact Wrestling on Access TV and appearing at Hard to Kill, wrestling at Hard to Kill, and because Kenny Omega was now locked in for that Impact Rebellion event, plans change. And in this case, it's not necessarily plans so much changed, because I think this was always going to be the original destination of Rich Swann versus Moose. I just think plans got delayed, and they merged two storylines together. I questioned this a couple of times here on the channel, and again, you can go back and check it out. I questioned this a couple of times with what I questioned was, you had two World Championship storylines going on in parallel, because you had Moose versus Rich Swann, because again, they've been teasing it since October. That was the Impact Wrestling storyline, but parallel to it, you had the Kenny Omega and Rich Swann storyline as well, and eventually they have to meet. In the form of a triple threat match, in the form of a singles match, they had to do something about it. You can only tell two parallel stories for so long, and the longer that this Impact Wrestling AEW relationship goes on for, eventually you've got to merge the two together and you've got to have your payoff, which is going to be at Impact Rebellion. So I think for Impact Wrestling, you know, we did a video last week talking about the strong ratings and the strong viewership and the strong demographic, strong viewership for Impact, you know, for Impact levels that they had last week. And given these big matches are on the horizon, the champion versus champion unification match that's going to happen at Sacrifice, the big interpromotional match that's going to happen at Impact Rebellion, it's a really exciting time for Impact Wrestling. It really is. And I would think that the Impact Wrestling executives are looking at the ratings that just having FinJuice from New Japan did last week. If they can really harness to some great promotion with this champion versus champion match, and of course the Kenny Omega return and match at Impact Rebellion, then they've got to be hoping, obviously, then they can once again do some big numbers for themselves. Are they going to beat the Kenny Omega debut episode that they had in December in terms of the viewership on Access TV and the Twitch numbers? I think it's debatable, and I think this might seem a bit paradoxical here, but I think it doesn't really matter on that side of things what Impact Wrestling does. Impact Wrestling, if they promote it themselves, they will only hit a certain level. What they have to hope for, and I mentioned this in the ratings video last week, what they have to hope for is the external promotion from the companies that they're working with. So with Kenny Omega versus either Moose or Rich Swann at Impact Rebellion, they have to hope and they have to talk to AEW and say, look, your world champion is going to be facing our world champion in the main event of one of our biggest pay-per-views of the year. I know it's not on the level of a Slammiversary or Bound for Glory, but it's going to be a huge pay-per-view. We need you to promote it, because if you promote it, if you promote our TV program, we're going to do some really, really good business. And ultimately, that's why Impact Wrestling have generated this relationship with AEW in the first place. It's because it's good business, it's great exposure for them, it gets AEW talent on their show, and it gets some Impact Wrestling talent to go over to some other shows, develop and become bigger stars and get some better exposure for the company. So will these matches, Rich Swann versus Moose, and then the Kenny Omega match at Impact Rebellion, will that do big numbers for Impact on Access TV and in their pay-per-view business? They would certainly hope so, but I'm not necessarily sure. It's completely up to them. Again, they have to focus and lean on their partners here. They have to lean on AEW, say, look, I know you've got Revolution coming up. We need some promotion of our own. If you can do that for Rebellion, if you can do that for Impact on Access TV, that would certainly benefit us massively, because every time you've heavily plugged something, whether it was Kenny Omega's debut or even New Japan, they've got to lean on New Japan as well. Say, can you heavily promote this? Because when New Japan have promoted their stuff, whether it's just FinJuice in the main event of Impact Wrestling on Access TV, they've done really good numbers and really good business. So ultimately, they've got to lean on those partners again. But it's a really big time for Impact Wrestling. Again, huge huge main event for Sacrifice that originally I think was going to be on a pay-per-view, and then an even bigger match at Impact Rebellion featuring the AEW World Champion versus the Impact World Champion. We don't know the stipulation for it yet. We'll talk about it once it gets officially announced, but potentially title versus title. We could be crowning an AEW and Impact World Champion, someone holding both bouts. What a massive story, and what a great picture that would be. Just, it blows your mind how historic that could be. So it's a really exciting time, isn't it? But of course, as always, this is just one man's opinion. What are your thoughts on Rich Swann versus Moose, title versus title for Impact Sacrifice later next month? Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. I'll do my best to respond and reply to all of your comments. Really enjoy interacting with you guys, talking about Impact Wrestling, AEW, WWE, New Japan Pro Wrestling, all things pro wrestling here on the channel. So be sure to get involved with the community, drop a comment below. All opinions are welcome. If you have enjoyed this video, please do smash a like on the like button too. Really does help us out here on YouTube, go up the rankings and get to people's recommendation feeds if they haven't seen our videos previously. But most importantly, if you haven't already, please do subscribe to Wrestle News 365. You can do that by clicking the bottom right hand corner of the screen right now, or if you wait a few seconds, there'll be a subscribe button at the end of this video along with another video for you to watch. Thank you very much for watching, listening, streaming, or however you come across this video today, and I'll speak to you again very, very soon. Hey guys, thank you for watching, listening, streaming, or however you come across this video today. Be sure to click on the video on the right there to watch our next video, or click the bottom there to subscribe, or the bottom right hand corner. Thank you very much, and I'll speak to you again very soon.